stream and then we'll get going here. Okay, here we go. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first event of Hillary term. Before we begin, a couple of quick announcements. Firstly, this is your last term as your committee. If you'd like to be a member of this committee for Trinity term onward, myself or anyone else on the committee. Secondly, we're going to be resuming our termly war game this term, a bit of a cybersecurity theme. Should be appropriate for members. So keep an eye out or sign up email for that coming out later in the week. And of course, we're pleased to welcome our speaker for this event, Mike Rogers. He's a former U.S. representative and chair of the House Intelligence Committee. He now speaks on a number of national security topics, particularly related to cybersecurity, as well as the occasional op-ed or congressional briefing. Today, he'll be speaking to us on the need for a national cybersecurity coordinator. Please take it away.
Well, thanks, Matthew. And I used to be an FBI agent, and if any one of Matthew's classmates would like to see his FBI files, I can probably arrange that for just a small donation. We can make that happen. Okay, no feedback. I'm going to take it that you laughed hysterically. It's all good. So my name is Mike Rogers, former member of Congress. I was also the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. I now sit on several cybersecurity company boards, all small startups making their way in the world. And I also serve as the vice chairman of a very important company in the United States called MITRE Corporation. It's a not-for-profit public mission company, meaning the government sends us really big, hard technical problems and says, can you help us fix that? And so we have 6,000 engineers of all stripes, from data engineers to electrical engineers and everything in between, that work on these really hard problems. So we stay pretty close, and I stay pretty close to both the new cyber trends, as well as the kind of big institutional problems we have moving forward, certainly in the United States. And for all of your home countries, you're going through the very same thing. It doesn't matter size or scope. Everyone on this call, I guarantee you, wherever you call home, is experiencing the same kind of cyber penetration problems and theft problems and espionage problems as the United States. So I thought what I would do is a couple of things here quickly. I would I want to highlight what the SolarWinds, and that's important because it shows, in my mind, why the United States needs a forcing function, acting level director for cybersecurity across the United States government. So if you're at all familiar with cyber, and you don't have to be outrageously familiar, but the interesting thing about the SolarWinds case, and if you're not familiar with it, it was attributed to the Russians who got in to many U.S. departments in the U.S. government as a massive espionage campaign. It was a campaign designed to collect information and get it back to Russian, we believe, policymakers. And also to look for vulnerabilities in our big, writ large American system of government. And so it was very successful. And if a couple of things you can take away from it, it's as bad as you've read about in the paper, maybe even worse. It's going to be with us, the United States, for a while. It's going to be very hard to get out of our systems. And unfortunately, there will be copycats aplenty. Coming to try to do the very same thing. And so that first big public supply chain hack, meaning that they got in through the supply chain, they used somebody that isn't directly associated with that unit, but supplies goods or services to that unit. And they were able to get into that company to get into the US government, in this case, SolarWinds. Prior to that, the big one was a company called Target. It's a big retailer here in the United States. We think that a criminal organization used nation state caliber, what we would call tradecraft, in order to get into Target. And what they ended up stealing is over 100 million credit card pieces of information, and then all of the personal identifying information that went with them. So it made it a pretty dangerous, expensive criminal hack. And they did that through a supply chain. They went into the company that provides, in the States, we call it HVAC. So think of air conditioning and heating and those kinds of things. So it's a big supplier to these retailers to provide that kind of service. The bad guys mapped out all that this particular HVAC company, and they found out that they could ride along when they did an electronic billing service. So they rode along on the billing service. The electronic bill went to target headquarters. Target headquarters then was infected. They spent their time looking around, trying to map out the network. Were able to eventually get all the way down to the card swipers. When you go to check out and you swipe your card or put your chip in, didn't have chips in 2013 the way we do today, but swiped your card and all of that information was immediately going up. It was a really interesting case because they would send it to servers that were designed to carry large advertising bulk data for Target, meaning it was not suspicious for large amounts of data to work through these servers. So they were thinking ahead. They realized that's where they're going to have the least amount of scrutiny from cybersecurity professionals in this particular server set. And so that's how they got the information out. So they stored it up, and then when they were ready, they just had a massive dump of this information. Pretty hard for this cybersecurity teams at Target to catch it. Fast forward, what made this really interesting, and which is again why we're going to talk about why we need a cyber director in the United States, and we're going to get one. Matter of fact, one was named already to be nominated to go through the process to get there. Her name is Ann Neuberger. She's just an exceptionally talented engineer, has been with the National Security Agency for a very long time. I think she's going to be great. Anyway, what happened in SolarWinds, this was a supplier. They provided goods and services. In this case, IT. They weren't a security company. Their job was basically to move the data around in the way that was most efficient for the government and control their big IT systems. And what happened was the company, or we think the Russian intelligence services, knew that, got into that particular company through very, very weak protocols, bad cyber hygiene. They used social engineering. They used all the techniques that you all probably brushed across if you've looked at cyber intrusions at all. They used them all to get in. Once they were in, they did something. This was the very different thing. They were able to take tokens or signatures, electronic signatures, and mimic them to where you couldn't tell. So what that means is when I send any bit of a data patch to a company, we've already had these pre-established security clearances, if you will, a password, if you will, or a gate check. What's the code? What's the code word at the gate check? And so what they did is they were able to mimic. There's electronic tokens, or they call them signatures a lot of times, and protocols, and they mimicked them exactly. So what they did is they acted like they were SolarWinds from SolarWinds servers, sent this a patch packet back in March that looked, and so the other computer system at the government looked at it and said, oh, yep, that's a SolarWinds token. That's a SolarWinds signature. Yes, we take that. And there's no human being involved at that point. These are all predetermined, pre-established checks. So it's machine to machine. And what was happening was, and this happens a lot, they would repackage that. So when that particular unit in the government got that, they would add their whatever work that they were adding to this particular patch. Then they were adding their signature or their token on it. And so they were really eliminating that first token and saying this whole packet now is secure. And that went on throughout the system. And you can see how that would be once you're in, pretty hard to get that out. And so the other part of this is that they mapped this out exceptionally well. One of the ways that they figured out how to get into the particular sweet spots in the U.S. government is they stole tools. So this was a very long operation from a company called FireEye. FireEye is primarily a forensic company, and what they do is they do red teaming and other things. And so they had a set of tools that they would use. You would call them up and say, hey, would you check my system? They would come in, run these set of tools. It would look for vulnerabilities, and it would also map your network. Well, the operators in this particular case, the people who were thieving, stole that first before they actually went to the mimicking of the tokens. And so they understood exactly how a company like FireEye would map out a company and track these vulnerabilities. So they developed their malware in accordance with understanding those tools, and some of the tools they reused and put it in this malware packet back in March. Pretty smart. And that wasn't the only smart thing. This is why, again, so many people are saying this was so impactful on the information they were able to steal. The other part is we have a relatively new agency in the United States called the Cyber Information Sharing Agency, and its job was to try to track bad things happening to the U.S. government across the whole buckets of U.S. government activities, and then share that and say, hey, something bad has happened in here. You might want to protect your system over here. That all would work well normally, except for one problem. In the mapping part, they were able, the perpetrators of this were able to get into that system, and they weren't disrupting it, they were monitoring it. So imagine all of the traffic that was going out to say, hey, we saw this anomaly in June in your network. You may want to pay attention to this. Guess what? They saw all of that. So they were able to adjust accordingly while they're penetrated into these systems. Really brilliant. And what the other part they did, and everyone should know, and you probably do know, about 80% of all really successful hacks like this come from stolen credentials. Well, they had done such a great job stealing credentials, and that's passwords and things like that, what your password is, what your username is, all of those kinds of things. They actually got to the place in the administration of certain government agencies where they could create their own administrative clearance, right, in that system, made up a name, took on those credentials. And so what they were doing is actually controlling inside the network. They were actually controlling the administrative functions about what could and what couldn't, who could and who couldn't inside the system. And that was them. They were actually had stolen enough credential at senior level. And so you want this kind of management access level credential. Well, they found some, stole it, got so good at it, they were actually creating their own administration and elevating their ability to get that kind of level of access and using that fake account. Really brilliant. The other thing they did to us, and again, this is for most countries should pay attention to this as well, is they actually found a domain name, created a domain name in the United States. They used that domain name, and they also used U.S. servers. And why that's important in the United States is because our National Security Agency can't monitor servers in the United States. So they had no ability to even see any of this happening, even though they were attacking a government agency. And the Russians knew that, and they used that to their advantage. And the FBI, by the way, is more of a, oops, clean up on aisle 9. You have a problem in your company. We're going to come help you with that. And we're going to try to figure it out and try to go after them criminally. They're not proactively searching to find bad things. Every once in a while they do, but that's not their main focus and mission. And certainly no other government agency, including our Department of Homeland Security, doesn't do that as well for a whole host of reasons. We have a whole bunch of legal reasons, and they're good reasons, by the way, to make sure that the government isn't poking around your servers and your email traffic and other things. So if you look at all of those things wrapped up, really, really effective. That's why here in the United States, people went just crazy about it. We thought this is a big and it's intrusive and it's bad. It was all espionage related, meaning they were just trying to steal information, which they stole a bunch, and were very, very successful at it. The last piece of this that I think is important, they put in something that we call droppers. Everybody has different names for them. They would hollow out pieces of an administrative function in your IT system. So if you're running a scan, might be a function that says, make sure that this switch is at 00110, whatever. And if it's not, you contact your security guy, something might be going on. So they would have these administrative functions that they would take over and build in. Well, what would happen is you run a scan, that's all it is. It looks pretty normal. The scan keeps going. But they had the ability to drop malware into those areas of which they controlled. So now it's changed what that protocol might look like when they wanted it to. So you can change it and it would go do bad things, and then they would change it back. So I run a scan, I don't see anything. I just see what an administrative function looks like. Called droppers. We had this happen in another place in the government, and it was a nightmare to try to find and get out and remove. And many people here in the States were saying, why don't we just burn, they call it burning down the stack, take out all of your servers, get rid of them, and restart over. That's how bad they thought it was. But there isn't enough servers in the world, think of this, under production that could replace the amount of servers we'd have to replace. Think of that for a minute. It's just staggering. And so this is that other problem that it's going to be here for a while. And other people are already mimicking it. We understand that Chinese intelligence services are looking at it, studying it. The Iranian services are looking at it and studying it, trying to figure out how they can use it. And they won't use it just against the United States, and certainly Russia won't use it just against the United States. Any NATO partner is subject to get attacked in this way. And so I want to talk about the cyber director. So we have this big, expansive federal government. We have agriculture and education, and we have Department of Defense, and intelligence is almost a separate thing. And they all have their own budgets, their own leaders in cyber. And so it created this silo effect, really. And it allowed, in this particular case, that siloed effect. Even though we had this agency that was supposed to be connecting the dots, it allowed them to get through and stay in for a very long time before we were able to detect it. And so one of the things that I decided, and by the way, I used to be the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. This was an issue that came before me when I was chairman. And I freely admit it, I didn't like the idea at the time. I thought, no, the president should have the prerogative to be able to appoint a cyber czar, if whatever they were calling it at the time. And a good friend of mine, he's a Democrat from Rhode Island, came in and said, no, I really think we need this. And we had a friendly discussion, and I said, no, Jim, now's just not the time to do this. Well, that was under George Bush. Then we went through President Obama and then President Trump, and none of them got a handle on this. So even though they said, don't do it to us, we can do it, I've come to the conclusion that my good friend Jim Langevin was exactly right, and that we absolutely need a forcing function to be able to try to make sure that we're all playing well in the sandbox together. And in the United States, we have big personalities into these fights about who controls what. And I don't mean people, I mean agencies. So Department of Defense is a big 800-pound gorilla. The National Security Agency is a 799-pound gorilla. That list just keeps going on. So when they have these discussions, everybody goes in and fights for their interests. The only way to get around that, I think, is to have this cyber director at the White House reporting to the President of the United States and trying to coordinate their budgets and making sure that we have test procedures along the way that a company like SolarWinds, when they're penetrated, is not allowed to impact as many agencies across the government as actually happened. And so that's kind of where we are at in America. As I said, the person who's been nominated under the incoming administration she's just phenomenal. She's been doing this work for a very long time. I happen to know her personally. She's going to be great at doing this. And I argue it's about time. And the only trick here in the U.S. government is you have to have the ability to have the presidential imprimatur in order to get those big personalities in a room and get it to work out. If you don't, our cyber director here in the States will not be impactful on doing this. And why is this important? Department of Agriculture or Education? Because in education, we have all of the student loans go through our Department of Education. Think of all that PII that's there. Department of Agriculture, we do all of our welfare and food stamp programs in the United States. Think of all of the PII, personal identifiable information that's there. They need to have as high a standards as our intelligence services do. And right now, we're kind of a hit and miss across the agencies. So there's my spiel on both. Thanks for allowing me to be the first one. As I said, any stories you would like on Matthew, I'm happy to provide.
Thank you very much, Congressman Rogers, for that fascinating, if not frightening, overview to the state of cybersecurity affairs today. I think what we're going to do here is open up the floor to the Q&A. So if you're on the call, please use the raise hand function, or you can type into the chat and one of us can read it out. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to type into the chat. And again, we can read it out and direct your question. So to kick things off, I think the first hand I saw was from William Evans. So if you'd like to go ahead.
Just put my camera on. Thank you very much, sir. That was a really interesting talk. We're living in a period of hostile state competition, and obviously the United States and the West are under on the receiving end of attacks from the Chinese and the Russians all the time. And there are sensible people in Washington and London who know that these are the intelligence services that are attacking us. The problem that strikes me is that is the attribution, because we know it's them, but sometimes it's very difficult to tell our allies that because it comes from very sensitive techniques and all the rest of it. How do you see us overcoming this problem as this becomes just part of our daily lives? Over.
Yeah. And unfortunately, sir, it is part of our daily lives. We are absolutely under siege, and I say we collectively, the world. There's some very low consequence for cyber intrusions and high reward. And anytime you've got that mix, these countries that may not have a lot to offer the rest of the world, this is certainly one way that they can kind of level set the playing field for them in their eyes. And so attribution has actually gotten better. Even I would say 5 to 6 years ago, we weren't as good on attribution as we are today. And it is a difficulty. I think what started that, we had this long conversation, and I worked with the Obama administration at the time to come out and say the North Koreans did the Sony hack, if you remember all of that. And that was really, everyone wrestled with it. No, people didn't want to talk about it. People thought, well, no, let's keep that quiet because it's sensitive. And so my argument is attribution is almost as important as understanding where they're coming from. We've gotten better where we can find out how they get there, kind of. But if we don't have this sense of who did it and how we work together to prevent it, and that is this attribution part. We are going to have some interesting discussions, I think, in the next couple of years about how and when is the right time for attribution. And just so you all know, that the intelligence community's perspective has always been, listen, if I've finally gotten onto them, and that's not an easy thing to do, but I've gotten onto them and I'm watching it. And by the way, the Brits and the United States are Canadians, and they call them the Five Eyes, the Australians and the New Zealanders all talk about this a lot. And then we talk about with our extended allies across NATO and Italy and Germany and other places, France. But it's this weighted risk of, do I continue to watch them and know what they do, or do I try to turn it off or disrupt it and then publicly try to acknowledge who they are or share that with allies? And I don't think any circumstance is going to be exactly the same. I think the value of those, plugging into the right place is huge. But so is stopping this stuff. So William, I wish I had a good answer for you. I think we're still in the process of working that out. But again, we are much better at attribution now. It makes it easier to say, hey, the Chinese did this, the Russians did this, because we're better at signature tracking, even when they try to obfuscate the origin of the attacks. That's still hard, but I think we're better at it today.
Thank you. I wonder if you could quickly expand on one point you kind of brought up there. You were talking about attribution, but could you circle back a little bit to the idea of intelligence sharing and what you see the role of that being, whether that be with Five Eyes, with NATO allies, or even between the agencies, as we were talking about, there is quite a power struggle there, and how that might be able to address some of the issues, the cybersecurity issues we're facing?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, my vice chairman and I, when I was chairman, introduced the first cyber sharing bill way back in 2012. That was the first big fight. And we've been trying to get this right for a long time. And so in the United States, we have the one thing that, and let me back up. The whole impetus of that bill was, if the government has something, why not try to share it as high upstream, closer to the internet providers as we can, to try to weed that out of the system, or at least send alerts that this may be lurking out there. And same with the business. Remember, the NSA doesn't get to see all of that traffic, neither does the FBI. And so there's huge, huge loopholes where bad actors can swim around and cause us problems, and they do. Wouldn't it be great if we all shared? So the private sector shared back to the government and said, hey, have you seen this signature? We just saw this. This is bad. And that would get into the ecosystem and share widely. That's really was the idea of it. And so we had the issue here that we wanted to make sure that people who were sharing in good faith didn't get sued for it if something went wrong. And we couldn't quite get the language right to make it interesting for businesses. So we still have a cyber sharing bill, but it makes it very difficult if a company, and you're sitting on the board, making sure you're protecting your shareholders and the company moving forward. Pretty hard to say, well, let's share with the government if we might get sued for doing that. And so that has been a big hurdle in the United States. I know that Britain and other places have different legal systems, and it's a little easier almost to get into those arrangements. But sharing is absolutely critical. The more transparency we give, it's like disinfectant. The more you can shed the light on techniques and tactics and what they're doing and how they're doing it, the better off we are, because private security companies can step up in those breaches and help protect those companies. And the government isn't going to be able to do this by itself ever, never. And I'm not sure we want them to do it either. So the private sector security framework and ecosystem plays a really incredible role. So the better we can make them, the better we're all going to be protected. On intelligence sharing writ large, outside of the cyber realm, we are exceptionally good. Certainly our British friends, you can't get any tighter relationship than we have in the sharing relationship. I mean, there are things that are really raw that we send back and forth just to make sure we don't miss something. We really don't have that relationship with anyone else. We're pretty close as Australians, Canadians, and New Zealanders, and then writ large our NATO partners. And we try to share as much as we can to protect those countries. That if we think that it provides some level of protection to know that information, we're pretty good about it. Because without that sharing piece, it's no good. I always looked at the job of the intelligence community is to find out their secrets. And if we can not make them secrets anymore, we win. And so the more we can do that in the sharing regime, it's still hard. It's very personality driven, even today in 2021. And so that's this constant struggle to make sure that people understand it's valuable to bring people in and let them understand what the risks are. And now you can't tell everybody all the time, obviously. You want to try to do it with trusted partners that won't send that information to our adversaries or leak it to our adversaries or leak some of the tools that we use to our adversaries. All of that continues to be consideration when we share.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that thorough answer. We're
Right.
going to go over now to Andy Laurie, was I think next, and then Graham, if you'd like to go after him. I think I hear Graham there. Does that work?
Yeah. Thank you for your excellent insights. Taking as an example, the 2017 cyber attack on the UK Parliament, this had none of the sophistication of the attacks you mentioned. It was, as far as I'm aware, basic credential stuffing, and they managed to compromise only 0.5% of accounts. So 99.5% of the accounts were fine and secure, but that still included a member of Parliament, a member of the House of Lords, etc. To what extent is this ever going to be a winnable battle when you're facing a global, unknown, unseen adversary on a platform that just makes it very hard not only to identify someone, but also to prove that they've actually taken these actions? And to what extent is it always going to be a case of just constantly closing one door after the next once the horse is already bolted?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. I'm not sure where it will ever be done. We are always going to be constantly in this cycle of trying to keep up with adversaries working their way in. And remember that even just in the regular operation of an IT system, millions and millions of lines of code. And I always argue whoever controls the patches, controls your life, right? Because that's where if you get a malware in a patch, which happened in the SolarWinds thing, you're done, you're toast, because it gets inside your firewall. It's really hard to catch. And so people are still trying to steal credentials. Let me tell you another part of that, if I may, which is why I think this is always going to be here. And you say, okay, well, we're going to get really good. We're all going to be secure. We're going to hunker down. I used to be an FBI agent in the 80s and 90s. And if you could ever recruit a Russian code clerk at an embassy, boy, promote immediately, right? Because that is just the hardest person to get at in an embassy. Why? Because they control the encryption coming in and going out of that embassy. And the Russians, the Soviets at that time, just at the end of the Soviet reign, knew that. So they just locked these people in. They'd fly in, they'd be heavily escorted from the airport into the embassy, and they'd never come out again. Well, think about now, that the operation, the human intelligence side for collection. So I don't have to always just break in through a cyber intrusion alone. And the easiest, best way to do this is if I can steal your credentials or get you to give me your credentials. So now every network has an administrator. Well, that code clerk went from one in an embassy to thousands and thousands of people that would be potential targets for these folks to get at. And nowadays we put everything on social media. And so again, as a young FBI guy, we were taught on pattern of life profiling. So who is this person? How do I, if this person comes out of the embassy every Tuesday and goes to the gym and then gets a coffee at this place and then has breakfast or whatever down the road, whatever that pattern of life was, became important for us to try to build up, okay, how do I approach this person and see if I can't get them to cooperate with us versus working for the Soviets at the time. Well, think of the same thing now and think how easy that is. Everything from LinkedIn to your social media to your Facebook page to Instagram, all of that is just manna from heaven for a counterintelligence investigator. I can look at all of that and figure out who you are. Probably if you're religious or not religious, you go to if you're Jewish or Muslim or Christian or none of the above. Where your parents live, where your friends live, your kind of activities. Think of all that information. Now that information used to take months to put together when you would target someone. Well, if I'm sitting in Moscow or Beijing, I'm sitting in Tehran, I'm in Seoul. You think about what activities you can do to try to get into somebody's head to try to steal your credentials or even figure them out. And so now I just have to get enough information to put into an AI algorithm to figure out, okay, I might be able to get close enough to this person's username and password using all of the pattern of life activity to figure it out. And by the way, this isn't crazy talk. We watched a nation state do this in some remote electric grid areas of the United States. They used all of that kind of pattern of life information and then put it into this massive AI algorithm to guess credentials. And candidly, they were successful in doing it. Think of that. And so I think this is going to be here for a long time. Now, you get to quantum, and can quantum help you change the game? I argue yes, but we're nowhere close to that. So I think this is be a constant cat and mouse game. The better the security folks get, the more that we're relying on being connected to the internet. That means more vulnerabilities, more gaps. Every time a supplier moves to one company to another or purchases something, or all of that is a vulnerability chain in supply chain management. And so you start to scratch your head and think, we're never going to get ahead of this. And candidly, the answer is we're never going to get ahead of this. We can get better, but it's always going to be with us. I wish that's not as uplifting as I wanted it to sound, but I'm sorry.
Thank you for the pessimistic answer, nonetheless. Graham, did I hear you with a question?
Yes, sure. Could you say whether governmental intelligence sharing makes the problem worse?
Interesting. I don't think it does. So there's different levels of sharing, and so I can. The British, again, we are really, really lashed up at the hip. And so we would probably share as much with the British and the Australians if they needed it, and the Canadians, but on a day-to-day basis, I would argue that the British-American relationship in intelligence is really first rate. And with them, we might share, here's how we found it, here's what it exactly looked like, here's what we did. You can't do that with everyone. Because we don't, the circle of trust in some other countries, we just don't have that. And so we don't know what security protocols they have in place to make sure that information doesn't get passed along. We have had cases where sharing has disrupted operations, no doubt about it. And so we tend to have kind of that return on investment, if you will. If we share this and it goes bad, can we withstand that? What harm can we take if we share this bit of information. And one, and it works both ways. I don't know if you remember the information that the British shared with us, in the early 2010s on terrorist activity, that ended up, somebody fairly leaked the specifics of it. It happened on the U.S. end, man. I was mortified, but happened on the U.S. end, and it really screwed up a British source, of which they had to close down and pull out and all of that. So it happens both ways. No one is immune from this. And so I think that's what you're talking about. I would argue, as an afterthought on that question, and this has happened, we've had big agencies lose their tools. Their tools get leaked. To me, that's more dangerous than the leaking of, we know this at this time, almost. Because now somebody can take those tools, re-engineer them, and use them against companies and other governments and other things. And we've had several instances here. I know the Brits have, and I don't doubt that there's any government out there that works on these collection tools that hasn't had this happen. And that, to me, is more dangerous. I worry more about that. And if there's an offensive tool, imagine, that gets out, which happened a few years ago. It was attributed to the United States. I would say don't always believe your attribution publicly in the papers, but it was pretty lethal. And we do know that people took it and re-engineered it and has used that at less resilient targets. Let me put it that way.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. So our next question comes from our YouTube chat, and it's circling back a little bit to that somewhat pessimistic outlook you were painting for the future. So the question reads, you said that we need to make sure that when the likes of solar winds are penetrated again, we need to make sure that it's not allowed to happen across so many agencies as before. Does this mean it is a question of when it happens again, not if? Are we always going to be fighting a losing battle against such a cyber penetration by hostile state actors? Just wondering if you have some more insights on that.
Yeah, it's a very tough battle, and there is lots of investment on nation states around the world to get engaged and get their tradecraft better to have success, right? If you don't have aircraft carriers, what better way to get in, cause trouble in the United States than through cyber network penetrations and disruption and other things. Great. Aircraft carriers are expensive. That is not. And so what we've seen is this huge investment in what in their terms would be offensive cyber operations, including disruption, disabling data trust, meaning what if they manipulate the data and the data you get isn't exactly accurate, but your machines think it is, that kind of thing. All of that's coming, and it is coming at us already. But there are ways that we have to continue to get better. So I believe with a cyber director, at least in the United States, I'm a big believer in what's called collective defense, and that got back to the cyber sharing question. Can we collectively gather up as many as we can under the same security banner so that we can watch these things happen? So if you get hit out on the perimeter, guess what? Everybody along that's connected in this collective defense knows that. And we can say, oops, and it looks like this, by the way, look for this. So two things I think are going to help us try to beat a solar winds piece of this. One is that collective defense. The more people we can put in, the better off we are. The other is behavioral analytics. Very few companies can do it. I happen to be on a company board that spends a lot of effort and time on understanding behavioral analytics. Meaning, if I have device A, let's say because now your device, you use it at work and going to work, and you get downloaded at home, all of that stuff happens, and that's only going to get more common. Well, that introduces a whole bunch of layers of vulnerability into the work that's happening with at least your company network. Well, if we know and map out a device that you have for work, and we see that at 3 a.m, you've never really worked at 3 a.m, and all of a sudden at 3 a.m, that thing starts downloading pretty large files and then moving them. And you're thinking, whoop, that would be a behavioral, even though it's inside the firewall, it would be a behavior that the security folks would say, whoops, that doesn't make sense. We need to check that or look at it or stop it, depending on what the protocols around the company is. Now, it could be as simple as, a late night homework assignment project for work, or it could be that somebody has gotten that computer, it's part of a botnet, and they're using your computer to send out information. And so all of that's possible. So I argue with this collective defense and behavioral analytics, and then really good firewall protections. All of these are different layers. I call it layered defense, including everything from, the honeypot operations, meaning we dangle things out there that looks really good to a cyber person. They think, ooh, that looks great. I got to get a hold of that. And it's really a mapping device for a company to say, oops, that's a bad actor trying to figure out what our network looks like. All of that has to happen on a layered defense. We just have to get better at it. And the first part of that is people just being aware of how bad it is. I'm hoping that this latest SolarWinds attack is at least that wake-up call to say, ooh, this is bad. Maybe we ought to take a look at our own company and see what's going on. And the other part of that, by the way, 18,000 companies got that patch for SolarWinds. Now, I don't think that the Russians were interested in 18,000 companies, candidly, but it doesn't mean they're not in there, and it doesn't mean they're not behind the firewall, and it doesn't mean they can't use those droppers at a later date to get into your system. And so all of that tells you how difficult it is. So, cyber sharing at the highest level, collective defense, behavioral analytics, and then using proactive events and lots of red testing, meaning you got to test yourselves. And you have to be honest about it. Have your system tested all the time, because somebody's want to get in there. So you have nation state actors do what they do. You also have thieves. Ransomware has gone up. I forget what the number is now. Something, I don't know. I think I maybe, don't quote me on this. I think it was in the 1,000% range in the last few years. And why? It's because it's so successful. I get in, I shut down your system. Pretty bad when the FBI of the United States tells a hospital when they called and said, what do we do? We're under siege here. They want X amount of money to turn our systems back over to us. And the FBI says, pay it. I mean, that's how you know you're not winning that fight. And so we're getting better at those too, but it's just going to be here. And once we've shut that avenue down, criminals will find another way to do things, and nation states will find another way. So it's just this constant investment and understanding. And everybody in the company needs to understand that they're responsible for the security of the data that's flying around.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question is going to come from James. So James, if you'd like to take the floor.
Hi, sir. It's good to see you again.
Hey, James.
Also, I would definitely like Matthew's FBI file, though I think I would be worried that I mentioned in it.
I think you're in the second volume. And that's a pretty big truckload. I couldn't even get it over to the UK. It's very expensive to send all that, by the way.
Oh, we probably send it digitally these days. Hopefully no Russians would be involved. Ideally, we'd like to deter these kind of attacks and like deterrence. And what do you think is the role of persist engagement or defend forward or whatever they're called like these days in deterrence by punishment and raising the cost of attack foreign policy versus by denial?
Yeah, and this is a huge, and it's a great question, by the way. So this has always been a big issue. It's a hotly debated question. Do you do some preventive things to these folks once you identify these bad actors? So units within the SVR, which we know does a lot of the collections, so the espionage work in cyber, is an SVR activity for the Russians. And think of all of these agencies are distant cousins to the KGB. So the SVR does that. And would it pay to get in and do disruptive things up front and have that persistent offense defense? I think they call it an aggressive defense, which is a polite way of saying, do you flick them in the forehead before they get you? And the answer is yes. Here's the problem. In the United States, we have, and this is true in Great Britain and all across Europe, the government isn't running these networks. And so, yep, we can get in there and do that, but do they go somewhere else in retaliation and take out a company in, small town Iowa in the middle of the United States? And that company's gone, right? All their data is gone, their IP is out, everything. They're just devastated. Yeah, they could do that. And so our argument is, how do we do that and still be able to protect the companies that can't spend all their money on cybersecurity? Remember, most of the companies that they're going after, at least in the criminal side, their job isn't Even IT, their job is to, produce X or Y or be a hospital, right? You don't normally think I need to build my cybersecurity elements up to protect a hospital, but now you do. And so that's the one thing that we have to be careful of. I always said, if you're going to go punch your neighbor in the nose, best to hit the weight room for a while first. And I'm just not sure America in and of itself is ready for what comes next. And then how do you control it? You don't want it to get to a kinetic event. Where a country is so hit and so devastated that they end up launching missiles or doing something worse, right? So all of that has to be in a calculation of what do we do on this. Now, we have had private companies who argue it's in their interest to go over and cause those problems. Okay, but I do worry I'm not worried about you, Company A, because you have the cyber capability, as good as a nation state. What about your supply chain? And what about the person that makes, lug nuts for your truck's tires in your distribution network? Are they ready for that attack? Probably not. And so this, James, is the biggest question that we have. I think you're going to see some interesting turns on offensive cyber or aggressive defense in the next couple of years, but it really can't be done. Think of the United States. I mean, here we were very worried about DOD and the intelligence community and the .gov, and they got into commerce and treasury, all very, very important departments with lots of information we wouldn't like our adversaries to have. Including other places, including DOD and other places. So if we can't protect our own network, how in the heck are we going to protect all these companies out there just using, AI and their networks to build a better, more efficient product? I don't know. So this is the general. You and Matt are going to have to figure this out, and all of your classmates. This is going to be your big contribution to the next 10 years in cyber. It's really a stumper.
Thank you, sir.
And don't forget to return Matt's file when I send it to you. It's really important.
Thank you very much for that. We've had another question that was sent in that's asking kind of about why we should believe different attributions given how politicized intelligence reports have become. So, with SolarWinds, for example, why do we know it's the Russians? And maybe that's not a good example because there is overwhelming evidence, but more generally, kind of back to that attribution question.
Yeah, so there's certain what they call signature patterns or tradecraft patterns that are consistent with use. Now, it doesn't always mean that it's that particular country. And so countries, the high-end players in cyber information operations, all of that, the Russians would be right up there. They're probably the best near peer adversary to us and the Europeans by far, and they're very good at it. And so good attribution has to take into account because many of these, by the way, remember this was actually launched from the United States, so it wasn't launched from Moscow, and so you have to go through the series. But what was interesting is that the way that they were able to take information from the servers and then move it and then move it and then get it back in Moscow was able to be determined. But you can imagine how difficult that is, right? And so that's why you don't see a ton of it. But on these massive events, when you have the whole of governments, plural, looking at who was responsible and how they actually performed to do that's how you get to that attribution level. It won't always work. Sometimes they don't know the attribution, or in the case of Target, many believe that it was an organized crime group in Eastern Europe who was using tradecraft at the time that was pretty consistent with what we saw in Russian intelligence services. And so they think that was a leech. It was debated, was it on purpose or was it on accident, where they got a hold of those sets of tools and that set of tradecraft to use it. Pretty hard to say that the Russians did it. We couldn't, never did on the Target thing. It would look like it was organized criminals trying to steal credit card information, which they did wildly successfully. And so attribution is important. This is still why you don't see them pointing fingers a lot and all the time. The most important thing we can do is mitigation. Stop the bleeding if you can, and then try to get them out of your network. That's the first phase of these things. Then try to figure out what they got a hold of, third phase. And at the same time, you're still trying to figure out who did it based on all of the signatures. What was the trade craft? How sophisticated, how difficult was that particular thing that they did? That mimicking protocols and mimicking tokens, really hard to do. That was a clue. Then you start looking at certain addresses and techniques to use those addresses. And I'll be the last part that we would call a clue in the FBI. Elements of the Russian intelligence service were mocking openly in social media. That's, again, that's normally a clue, right? They were very proud of their work. And once that happened, they were happy to know that elements of this particular intelligence unit was engaged, right? So I found that fascinating, but that's a pretty good clue. You don't always get those clues where they're bragging about it. Remember, they also sent a postcard to the CEO of FireEye that was kind of tracked back to the intelligence unit. A physical postcard. They sent a physical postcard and they were basically saying, "Hey, guess what? We can do just about anything we want." That was their kind of attitude. So you don't always get that, that fidelity in an attribution, but there's lots of other things that you can do. So the Chinese have certain signature sets that that we track and monitor and understand, and how they get information, to and from, and how their code, certain ways that code is developed. You can kind of see the signatures in there that would get you to attribution. But the bar is pretty high, and that's why you don't see it all the time.
Absolutely, and indeed, taunting seems like a pretty good giveaway. But
yeah, exactly. Even as an FBI agent, I could have solved that case.
To quickly clarify on one point, what, if anything, do you think can be done about the politicization, however, of these kind of intelligence reports and attributions and cyber attacks? Because that seems like a slightly different problem than just identifying who done it, so to speak.
Yeah, this is the time infinitum of a problem. Is this notion, is intelligence political by nature? My belief as someone who participated as in the collection side of it as an agent, to the chairman that did oversight, and then as a policymaker that used it. So I have seen every aspect of this. And I'm not a big believer in using intelligence as a political weapon, but eventually a policymaker makes the decision that based on what they know from intelligence, they're going to make a political decision. And sometimes that line gets blurred. I think it's gotten blurred worse than I've seen it, certainly in my lifetime. And I hope we can get away from that. I'm hoping that wiser heads will prevail. That and by the way, it doesn't mean that every time an intelligence report hits your desk that it's exactly right. The whole definition of intelligence isn't. I'd love to have gotten 100% fidelity on everything. It doesn't happen. Never happen. Very rarely does it happen. Let me put it that way. And what it is that you put lots of pieces of a puzzle together, and analysts who have lots of experience come to the conclusion that we believe with a high degree of confidence it's X, not Y. And so you take that, and you're supposed to be able to deal with that information and then try to make a decision from it. So what we have seen in the past is somebody finds a little bit that supports their narrative, and so they run around with their hair on fire saying CCC. And of course, if you read the whole thing, you go, "Oh, that's probably not the best interpretation of that. That's a political instrument interpretation of that." I don't know how you ever get rid of it completely. In America, we have this two-committee system that's supposed to be void of political rancor. It certainly was when I was chairman, because I made it that way. Not so much anymore. And so, adjustments will have to be made about what information gets into those committees, only because the way people have used this information. And so I worry about politicization of intelligence anyway. Because one thing you learn as a young investigator, when I was in my 20s, that if you think A happened, you are already in trouble. because you don't, because everything you find could fit into to the path of A. Might not be A, but if you know you're going here and something sounds pretty close, you go, oh, that proves that A is my guilty culprit. And so they beat on you about, be careful about making assumptions like that before you even get started. Make sure that the data that you collect and analyze gets you to A or B or C, not what your, hunches are great. They really are. But you got to prove a hunch and don't necessarily fit that in. Well, same with political use of intelligence. Every country has done it. We're no exception in the United States. And politicians are politicians the world over. And so some are going to continue to do that. We just need to challenge that, I think, from a citizenry about pushing back on that. And it's hard in this kind of more open society that we live in. And conspiracies, theories are, they travel a lot faster than the truth does, for sure, to kind of steal a bit of Winston Churchill's theory that a lie travels around the world faster than you can put your boots on, I think was his quote.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We're getting towards the top of the hour here, so I'm going to make a call for last questions. I know we've got one from Matthew, but if anyone has any final questions, please just raise your hand in the call or type your questions to YouTube now. So Matthew, over to you. No FBI files, though.
Yeah, please no. Please. You mentioned that you typically think of defense and in particularly secure networks, or at least we put a lot of focus during them. In terms of Treasury, Commerce, Cybersecurity can beat heads to tell people their networks more secure, but should existing agencies like the NSA and expand their authority and let them turn their skill sets inward to help defend? Or is this, new agency, is this too much of an overreach in the community?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
No, it's a great question. And we actually had this conversation last week, Matthew, with certain players, including members of our Congress. And part of the problem is the NSA is the best player on the field. And the Russians, this to me, the SolarWinds is such a great example of this. The Russians knew that. The Russians also understood what our laws were that said that the NSA is not looking in our domestic servers for this kind of activity. It's brilliant. And by the way, when they got outed, they burned everything down. So our forensics is slow and painful, including Microsoft, by the way. And so my argument has been, how do we, and I understand the politics of this at home, and I'm sure it's going to be the same way across Europe and our friends in Great Britain, that it's, nobody really wants the government reading their email. I get it. I don't either. But the question is, how do we get the best player on the field to help stop this into the game? Right now, they're not even on the field. They're in the locker room. Matter of fact, they may not even been invited to the locker room. And so we've got this weird thing that our paranoia about their participation has allowed our adversaries free rein to operate and do bad things. And so domestically, it's really hard. The FBI's mission is not proactive. It is by its very nature a forensic kind of organization. That's what it's designed to do, is put cases together and catch criminals doing bad things. And same with the Department of Homeland Security. It's really hard for that department to attract the right talent to be at the front end of protecting networks across the government. Probably not going to happen. They really need the NSA. So we're right in the middle today of these conversations about how it happens. And I will tell you, one of the members who I'm very close with, and I worked with a lot when I was on the committee, just said, just as politically, it's just not going to happen. So we have to think of something different. Just to give you an idea where the conversation is today, it's just not going to happen. So we're going to have to figure it out. So we are going to have to figure it out. Maybe it's a hybrid. My argument was, why don't we allow the NSA to stand up that information sharing agency with them and get it going, and after 18 months they have to leave, right? So stand it up, train people, bring people in, and then leave. At least it was only for 18 months, and then have lots of oversight, congressional oversight. So maybe that's a possibility. But the problem is, honestly, we have a, I know this is not popular, but, we're still suffering a Snowden headache and hangover in the United States, where a guy walked out of, with almost 2 million files, had nothing to do with what he was complaining about, and ended up turning it over to his Russian handlers, and along the way made the whole world believe that the NSA is doing really bad and evil things and reading all your email and doing those things. And so people believe it. It's really hard to get out of that narrative that just isn't the way it's operating today. The Russians know that. I'll guarantee the Chinese know it. The Iranians know it. So we just have to figure out and then do a better job of communicating. Now, intelligence or cybersecurity doesn't work if you don't have the faith and confidence of the people of that country. And so I think that's really important. We have to work on that piece because it's really important for us, and then figure out, okay, what will you tolerate for the NSA helping defend all of these agencies? How can you help us do that in a better way? That's where I hope we get. I think we're going to have, again, we're right in the middle of these. It's kind of very timely because we're right in the middle of these conversations now about what that's going to look like. And I don't know if we really know the answer today.
Thank you very much. So we have a question here that's been written in, and it's moving a little bit outside of the strictly government domain. So Nigel writes, as a business school academic, this presentation is stunning. My interest is intellectual property. What can be done to alert company boards and university IP offices about the deployment of droppers, as you called them, and other devices that you've described?
Yeah, I would, if I were at a university and or a corporate board, I would bring someone in to have these general discussions about how they operate. And I have to tell you, the Iranians about 2 years ago, using social engineering, using all the current techniques of cyber, were focused on professors doing research of which they were interested in. My numbers are going to be a little off. I'm going to be a little hazy on the numbers, but I think it was 174 universities. They ended up getting down to 80 some professors that they were very interested because they were interested in their research and just stealing them blind. And I hate to say this, and please don't take offense, Professor, but universities tend to be outward facing. I want to share my work. I want to share with the things that I'm doing to change the world. And that's, fantastic. And it's done such important, powerful things for the world. The problem is we have adversaries who understand that and take advantage of it to steal research. And by the way, they stole, again, I hate to use the number, but it was in the billions of dollars of intellectual property that hadn't been copyrighted yet, or it hadn't been patented yet. So it was in that phase of, we're going to go patent, we're going to go copyright, and it was gone. They stole it. And so you think about the devastating loss to those universities, the professors, what prosperity that means. And we know this happened to be an Iranian case. There's a lot of open source on this. If you look it up, you should be able to find some of this in the open source side. But I would absolutely, and if you're on the business side, I have to tell you, I'm a big believer. I don't even care if you hate cybersecurity, hate the thought of it. Nobody should graduate from a business school without having some cybersecurity. It doesn't have to be 0 and 1s coding, but it does have to be the policy of what can happen and show what can happen to IP. Because as a board member, and I am one, I worry about this a lot. Are we doing enough to protect the IP of which we've spent lots of money trying to develop in the private sector? And it gives you a little bead of sweat along the way. So I would actively engage, Professor, honestly, to try to bring someone in to have this discussion. I'm supposed to come visit Matthew in Oxford. I'm happy to come by and talk to you about it because I think it's that important. Because if we don't have these conversations, we're going to be in trouble. By the way, the solar winds, this is according to public reports, just to give you an idea why this is so important, is the fact that they changed over leadership at the company, Solar Winds. And one of the folks in the company said, hey, we probably ought to up our game on security. We're doing, IT infrastructure for the US government. And they said, hey, my job is to run the best networks, and get information from point A to point B when they need it. It's not security. which takes your breath away when you hear that, right? But there's a lot of companies out there that don't believe. I do X. I don't. It's not my job to worry about security. Somebody else needs to do that. At the end of the day, we are all under attack. We all need to be worried about security. I've been beaten on University of Michigan to have as part of their business school at least some cyber discussion. And again, you don't have to teach them to be coders. But if you're going to go out in the business world, you're going to need to understand you have an obligation to protect your intellectual property. And that's, by the way, the Russians stole a lot of intellectual property in this theft, lots. Wasn't it just a little bit? And they're very targeted. They called it whale hunting because they were very specific about where they wanted to go. They had all this access that they got, didn't use it all. They went to very specific places, stole IP, stole government secrets. Really, that's why people are just collectively guffawed about it. But anyway, I don't want to kind of go on and on, but I do think that it should be part of every curriculum. I wish people at universities would bring people in. You probably could have this conversation with people in your cyber department, just flip them over for a day, have them come in and talk to you about all the offensive things that they like to teach their students to do. Would give you, the hair on the back of your neck go up.
Thank you so much. So as a final question, we've had 2 questions sent in that are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. So if it's all right, I'm going to combine them a little bit to get your thoughts on them. So Damon asks about where we clearly define cyber acts that constitute an act of war, both in the US, but also in the international community, UN, NATO, international courts, etc. And Miri also asks kind of the same domain about how the US should go about tackling information or influence operations that are also conducted in the cyber sphere, and kind of whether those fall under the remit of a cyber director or if they deserve separate attention. So I hope that's not too big of a final question.
Yeah, that's a massive one. We could do a whole hour on the information operations that I spent a lot of time through the German Marshall Fund getting a handle on Russian information operations. Which are wildly successful, and massive. I do think it needs to come under the cyber czar because we have capabilities to fight it, and we need one place to be able to say, here's how we're going to go. Here's our rules and for pushing back on what we know to be information operations that the Russians are really good at. On what is an act of war, So this is a really tough question. Candidly, what we saw with SolarWinds, I do not believe was an act of war. It was an act of wildly successful espionage. If they were trying to disrupt things and turn things off and cause physical damage to things, the economy, or turn the lights out, you can't turn the lights back on, those kinds of things, those, in my mind, tickle up against what an act of war is. And I look at it as, does your act cause, or have the potential to cause physical harm to someone? You turn out the lights, the electricity, and a hospital can't get what it needs, and grocery stores can't get out what they need. That's a different idea. That's destructive. It's meant to be destructive. If I go in and steal your IP and take it back and repurpose it, that's not an act of war. Sure feels like it if it's your IP, but it's not an act of war. It's an act of espionage. So we have to be very careful. One of the things I thought drove me crazy in this one is that politicians ran down to the floor, and I say that like I wasn't one at one time. I was run down to the well of their chambers and say, this is an act of war and we must do something. And it to me showed that we just didn't have a good understanding about what just happened. And we need to get better at this. An act of war is pretty serious, and that would kick off a whole series of events that would be discussed as options for the President of the United States and our NATO and European and British allies would all have to have these conversations, because that's serious. And so we are getting there to understand the differences. I think publicly we're not quite there yet. But I think internally we start to understand what that means. And again, it's really important not to run around with our hair on fire when something like that happens. Know what we're talking about, because going down and saying it's an act of war makes people make decisions in their countries about what just happened. You know what I mean? You can see where this thing could escalate and get away from somebody in a hurry. So my argument is everybody calm down. We have to mitigate the problem. Then let's see what they were doing. Were they causing destruction? If they're not causing destruction, hard to argue it was an act of war. Are they setting themselves up for the future, right? We've watched where the Chinese get into U.S. electric grids, and we know why they're there. They're there to have the ability to turn off the lights if there is ever a conflict, right? That's not an act of war, but it's certainly concerning, right? So we need to get it out, but it's not an act of war. Don't want them in there for if something were to happen. So there's all these gradations of what that would look like. And so we just got to be careful on that front. On the information operations, honestly, could be a whole another topic, but for another conversation. But really, really serious problem. And the Chinese government services, their intelligence services, are also now getting better at it. We see them use the same tactics that the Russians did around Europe and here in the United States. And we see that they are having success in the Pacific Rim. And they're using expats, they're using conversations to try to influence certain conditions on the ground. Very, very concerning, which means once they master that, we watched the Russians do it in Eastern Europe, then they went around to Europe, then they came to the United States. Guess what? You watch the Chinese will have the same map. I bet we can map that out today and be pretty accurate about it. But I do think that's why I think one person, one director who has the ability to see everything, and they have to see everything. Nobody gets to hide. That would allow us to react and use certain tool sets to shut some of that down. Sorry, that wasn't too long for the last question.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for all your brilliant questions. We tried to get through as many of them as we could, but in the interest of respecting Congressman Rogers' times, we are going to end the Q&A there. So, Congressman, would you have any final remarks or anything that you'd like to say, or should we wrap up from here?
No, thank you very much for having me, number one. And for those of you who have watched in dismay at certain activities in the United States, know that at the end of a very bad day for our country, we proceeded to do what the Constitution allowed us to do. It was a bad day. It's a day we're going to have to reconcile with ourselves. I just don't want everyone on the call from our international friends to lose faith in the United States. I think you're going to see us come back as strong as ever. We're going to have some infighting. It's going to happen. Maybe it's going to be uglier than many of us want. We're going to get through that. But at the end of the day, our system is still working. We're still going to move out smartly in defense of liberty and democracy around the world. So hang in there with us. Know that this is like a family fight, and nobody wants to see that. But we are, at the end of the day, all family, and we all have lots of interests that put us in the same direction, including our security. So thanks for having me, and good luck to all of you this semester. And I look forward to having a chat again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all of your fascinating insights and your experiences, and most importantly, your time. Just a big thank you from everyone. And as well, thank you to all of you for your wonderful questions, as always. If you enjoyed tonight and you'd like to join us next week, it'll be same place, same time. We'll have Professor Timothy Garton-Ash, who will be speaking to us about, can a dictatorship be a member of the EU? And finally, as Matthew said in the beginning, if you've been loving OUSSG events this year and you want to get involved for next year, shoot any of the committee a message and we can go from there. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm the academic, and I'd just like to say that